we had the guys come to look at the furnace down here for the gym, and there is a card in there that controls the blower that is burned up. So they're ordering a new card. Hopefully we will have that by the end of this week, and I get that fixed back up and are ready to go before Awana's. I'm starting to think that when we were here a couple of weeks ago and that big storm came through and it flashed all the lights, that it may have burned up some stuff, including the motherboard on the computer and the card down there on the air conditioner, both of which were running when that happened. Thankfully, it doesn't seem like it has destroyed much of anything else. So, be in prayer for Awana. We start in 2 weeks, and excited about that, Sunday evenings. But this morning we're going to continue with our study in John chapter 18. We'll start in verse 15 and continue through verse 24. Been dealing with Christ in denial or Christ on trial and Peter in denial. And this morning we're going to look at part 1 of Peter's denial and part 2 of Christ's trial. Verse 15, and Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. That disciple was known unto the high priest, and went in with Jesus into the palace of the high priest. But Peter stood at the door without. Then went out that other disciple, which was known unto the high priest, and spake unto her that kept the door, and brought in Peter. Then saith the damsel that kept the door unto Peter, Art not thou also one of this man's disciples? He saith, I am not. And the servants and officers stood there, who had made a fire of coals, for it was cold. And they warmed themselves, and Peter stood with them and warmed himself. The high priest then asked Jesus of his disciples and of his doctrine. Jesus answered him, I spake openly to the world. I ever taught in thy synagogue and in the temple, whither the Jews always resort. And in secret have I said nothing. Why askest thou me? Ask them which heard me what I have said unto them. Behold, they know what I said. And when he had thus spoken, one of the officers which stood by Jesus struck with the palm of his hand, saying, Answerest thou the high priest so? Jesus answered him, If I have spoken evil, bear witness of the evil. But if well, why smitest thou me? Now Annas had sent him bound unto Caiaphas, the high priest. Let's bow for a word of prayer. Father, this morning, it is easy for us sometimes to get all offended and worked up, especially when we feel like we have been not treated properly. If we are innocent, we tend to claim our rights and to get all indignant. But we see in this passage that there could not be a more innocent person in your Son. And yet he is not indignant in claiming his rights, because he has committed himself to buy back humanity from the wages of sin. Help us to see your Son high and lifted up, even through the most difficult of circumstances. And in contrast, the failure of what we try to do in and of our own strength and power. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. We looked last week at first part of Jesus on trial, verses 13 and 14. It's developed here a little bit more for us. But what's interesting about John's account is most of the Gospels are like, well, here's this poor guy Peter, and he has this problem, and he denies him, and he denies him, and he denies him. John goes back and forth and kind of gives more information and fills in the gaps. And I like that. He is writing later, so he knows that the groundwork has been laid, and he is assuming that we are familiar with the Synoptic Gospels. But here in verses 15 through 18, we have part 1 of Peter's denial. It starts off interestingly because it says, and Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. You remember when they were left in the garden, they're all scurrying away. And at some point, Simon Peter is a very impulsive character. He thinks better of it, and he decides that he's going to follow the company to see what's happening. Now, Matthew 26, Mark 14, and Luke 22 all say that he followed at a distance. In other words, he was not walking with the band. But then a little bit of controversy arises because you have this, and so did another disciple. Most people assume that it's John because John does not write his own name. He doesn't refer to himself throughout his gospel. But there are a lot of folks who struggle with this because this guy seems to be able to get into the former high priest's house very easily. He is recognized, he is known, and they're saying, well, why would a fisherman know about that? It's not named, and it's interesting that Simon Peter is the one that is named first. I believe this is John, because usually when they're not named in the gospel, it means John. And John is really big on the details when it matters. And in this section, you're going to see that he gives us some details that other people don't. Now, you could hear somebody give an account of something that happened, and you could tell a family member or you could tell a friend in pretty good detail what somebody told you if you were listening carefully and you had good memory. But if you were there and you saw it, you would probably notice something that somebody else wouldn't notice and wouldn't think was a big deal. And so as we're going down through here, we're going to talk about this, but I'm pretty sold on the fact that this is John. It says, and Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. Notice that is one phrase. I've told you all before, I'm not ashamed of it. I hate grammar. I cannot stand grammar. I had an excellent English teacher in high school, Mr. Wood. Bless his poor heart, he had to put up with me. I loved literature. I would read books over and over and over again. But I hate punctuation. I can't stand it. And yet it's important. Right? I mean, if you are going to communicate with folks, then you have to understand how the language works and how it's put together. Or you could very easily be led astray. I was watching an interesting youth group game where a guy walked up and wrote a sentence on a chalkboard in chalk. Dating it, I know. It wasn't thrown off of his phone onto a smartboard or something. But he wrote on the chalkboard, and he asked the guys to add punctuation. And he asked the girls to add punctuation on their side. And when you read what he wrote on the board, even though he used identical English words, if you followed the punctuation, what the boys said and what the girls said was completely different. It's the importance of grammar. We have one phrase that is held together. Okay? Simon Peter is following Jesus, and so did another disciple. So before you get into anything else, you have to remember that, because that is the framework for the whole rest of the passage here. Another is also the Greek word allos. And we talked about this because when Jesus was telling them, it is important that I go away, because if I go away, I will send another comforter. He used this word, allos. Not another of a different kind. That's a different Greek word. He's saying another of the same kind. Okay? And so the link here is one of the 11, one that was like Peter, one that was in the garden is now following the band as they're making their way from the garden back to the former high priest's house. And if you look in commentaries, you'll see a lot of people that say, no, this was probably Nicodemus because he was influential and he would have been able to get into the high priest's house. You have some folks that say Joseph of Arimathea. Neither of those two are of the 11. And Joseph of Arimathea hasn't even come out publicly as a follower yet. He doesn't do that until he goes to Pilate and asks for the body of Jesus Christ. Only folks that the Bible tells us are in the garden are the ones that were the 11. And so if you were going to follow from the garden, you would either be with the band or you would have been without the band. That means the 11 disciples and Jesus, and you have the whole band here, okay? They all initially flee, but 2 of them come back. And given the nature of and the context of what's going on here, I have a really hard time believing this is anybody but John. This nameless disciple is thought to be someone not of the 11 because of their serious connections that happened here. He was known unto the high priest. He was able to walk out and speak to the lady that was guarding the door and go ahead and bring Simon Peter in. Those 2 terms that are used in the Greek are not casual terms of knowing. Every once in a while somebody will say, "Do you know so-and-so?" And they'll mention a name to me, and I have to sit there and think, oh, are they a customer? Have they been to our church? What context would I know that person in? In other words, what they're asking me is, are you familiar with this person? But you wouldn't use that term in the Greek if you were asking about a family member. Do you know so-and-so? Because it's assumed you know them. You have a much tighter, closer, more important link with them. And so that's why you have this interesting discussion, because it doesn't seem like John should be known to the high priest. It doesn't seem like John would be allowed into the palace area while many were not, especially if there is a servant girl that's keeping the door. And it seems to me that it would be odd that any but the 11 would have time to find out about the arrest and the trial. Did somebody go running off and tell Nicodemus, who in just a little bit we're going to find out isn't at Annas' house, he's at Caiaphas' house, because that's where the official, unofficial trial is going to happen. Caiaphas is the only one, we'll talk about that in a few minutes, that has the right to bring official charges. Okay? So you take him to the former high priest's house. Why would a member of the Sanhedrin be at the former high priest's house when officially he's needed at Caiaphas' house? So I can't see this being just somebody from the town or somebody who was in Jerusalem that was a follower of Jesus Christ. It doesn't make any sense to me. But look at the privilege, because this is what throws everybody off. That disciple was known unto the high priest and went in with Jesus into the palace of the high priest. Now it doesn't say, notice, language is important. Whether or not you like to study grammar, language is important. It doesn't say Jesus and the band went in and he followed. What does it say? He went in what? With him. In other words, as the group entered through this outer gate into the inner area, this disciple was right with him, and there wasn't somebody standing there going, "No, dude, you don't get to come." So not only was he known unto the high priest, but it seemed like an everyday, ordinary, acceptable thing for him to be walking with Jesus as he was accompanied in. It doesn't say this disciple is bound like Jesus is, and he's still going to be bound at the end. That's the last verse that we read today. But it does tell us that he is not following along like the other 3 Gospels tell us that Peter was doing. But what do we know about John? John was a fisherman. He was a businessman. In society, he wasn't a servant, he wasn't a slave, and he wasn't a shepherd. Now, the shepherds in society were looked down on. They weren't considered reliable witnesses. They weren't considered politically correct. They weren't welcomed very much in society. They were very much looked down on. It's amazing to me that God decided to choose a shepherd boy to become the king of Israel, because you can't get a farther jump in Jewish society than going from a shepherd boy to a king. But that's what God does to people. When he works in someone's life, he can radically change them from something that society would look down on and reject, and he can make them whatever he wants to make them and use them however he wants to in his kingdom. John and his family were kind of well-to-do. We know that because in Mark chapter 1, verses 19 and 20, we're told they had employees. Now, there were a lot of family fishing businesses in those days, but not all of the family fishing businesses had multiple boats. And, you're out there fishing and you holler for the other boat to come help you get the fish in. Seems like a bigger business than just Dad owned a boat and he and his son went out and fished by themselves. And if you have employees, you probably have a bigger business. Some of the historical documents claim that John may have delivered fish to the high priest's house before he was called as a disciple. But then when you start digging, and we're not going to spend a lot of time here because it doesn't really matter too much, but you see that he may have been of priestly descent through his mother Salome. You can find that in Matthew 27:56 and Mark 15:14, where you're comparing there, and you say, well, these girls are sisters. Well, if one of them was a descendant of priestly descent and they're sisters, then the others are also, right? And we know that Mary was cousins to Elizabeth, and Elizabeth is of priestly descent. So who knows? Maybe the high priest knew him that way. Whatever the reason, this is the important thing. This is why I say the details are important, and John, when it matters, is a detail guy. What he says here is, and that other disciple was known unto the high priest, that's important, went in with Jesus into the palace of the high priest, that's important. Not only did he know him and have a close known, he just hasn't heard of John, he knows who John is. If you know who John is, then you know he's a what? You have to know he's a disciple, right? How do you not know, if you know anything about John, how do you not know that he's a disciple? You want to do something interesting sometime? Dig through all four of the Gospels and find for me an important time in the ministry of Jesus Christ that John isn't present. He's all the time present, right? We got a B? B's attacking people in church. I don't know, in the Old Testament, when the heathen wouldn't leave, he sent in hornets and drove them out. Is he trying to tell us something this morning? John is the disciple whom Jesus loved. And he's one of the inner three, right? So when Jesus goes somewhere and he's taking any disciples with him, guess who's right there? When they go to eat, who is usually right beside Jesus? I mean, if you know John, you know he's a disciple. You say, why is that important? Because you get to verse 16 and it says, but Peter stood at the door without. Peter is not allowed to go in. Here's the whole group, and they're walking in, and John is recognized, and they assume that it is absolutely okay for him to go, and the lady doesn't stop him, and none of the band stops him, and John walks right in with Jesus because it seemed like a perfectly normal thing, but Peter has to stay at the outer door. He is not allowed even into the outer court. Okay? And here's poor old Peter. And you have to sit there and say, well, this poor guy What in the world? But the other disciple, when he realizes that Peter is out there and he and Jesus are in here, leaves Jesus for a minute, goes out, speaks to the servant lady, and brings Peter into the inner court. There's a question asked. He probably was not expecting this question. He's standing outside the door. He's probably as close to the door as he can get. He's probably listening for information because the other Gospels tell us that he wanted to know the end of it. What are they going to do with Jesus? How does this all turn out? And so we can jump on Peter and we can say, man alive, I can't believe you didn't step up to the plate. You denied him 3 times. You had 3 opportunities to do what was right and you failed. But you have to remember, there were 11 disciples. The Bible tells me there's only 2 of them standing here, right? And he's one of them. So does he fail and fail miserably? Absolutely. But he has a change of heart, and at least he follows along, and he's getting closer and closer to trouble here. The question is a simple question. He wasn't allowed in, but now this disciple comes and speaks to the girl at the door, and she lets him in. And as he is walking in, we have this: are you also one of his disciples? It's a kind of a casual thing because everybody knows John's one of his disciples, but apparently Peter isn't as well known. That's hard to imagine considering how boisterous and attention-getting he is, right? But apparently not. And the way she says this, the Greek shows that she is expecting a negative answer. I know who John is, and now John has come and gotten permission for you to come in. And so she's looking at Peter going, are you also one of his disciples? She is expecting him to say, no. And what does Peter do? He doesn't disappoint. I am not. Now, stop for a second and think about this, because let's look at the reason here. Why does Peter deny if John is known to the crowd and is allowed in and he's not in trouble? And why, if he can come back to the servant girl and get permission for Peter to come in, obviously it's got to be okay for him to go in, right? So what is the importance of a casual comment by a servant girl in the outer court to Peter? He's probably thinking, well, you know, this guy has the authority to come and get you. You must know him somehow, and we know he is a disciple of Jesus Christ. Are you also a disciple of Jesus Christ? Where are all the important people that are doing the arresting and doing the questioning? Where are all the insignificant people and the folks who haven't been in the garden? He has every opportunity to just say, yes, I am. He could have said, dude, I'm the number 1 or I'm the number 2. Most important, you know? You not know who I am? I'm Simon Peter, for crying out loud. Instead, he responds, no. Thought-provoking question. If you're worried about somebody identifying you at the door, then why do you go in? Right? And my mind goes back to when Jesus had to warn him, and he's like, oh, no, that's not going to forbid it, Lord. And over my dead body, get thee behind me, Satan. I'm going to tell you something. Before the cock crows, you're going to deny me 3 times. You'd think that would be like running laps in his mind. And then here they are at the garden, and a bunch of the disciples are at the gate, and he takes 3 of them in a little farther. 3 of those would have been Peter, James, and Okay? So you get to go farther with Jesus than the others. And Jesus is praying, and he comes back, and he wakes them up, and he says, listen, fellas, you need to pray that you don't enter into temptation. Why don't alarm bells start going off and saying, wait a second, there's coming a time here pretty soon where I'm going to have to be on my best. I better be ready for this, and I'm going to need some spiritual help. And when you walk through the door and a casual question is asked to you and you fail the test, why doesn't he think about what he said? It's going to happen 3 times. Verse 18, he's going to try and fit in. It sounds like John goes back and joins Jesus as if that is a totally normal thing to do, which makes me wonder, why didn't Peter feel like he could just stand right next to John while he was with Jesus? Why isn't that the normal thing to do? But it says in verse 18, and the servants and officers stood there who had made a fire of coals, for it was cold. And they warmed themselves, and Peter stood with them, and he warmed himself. Look at the company. Same word here, the servants and the officers. That is how the band of group that showed up in the garden was described. And so it sounds like the author here is linking and saying that most likely this is the arresting company from the garden. You say, why would they be there? Because nothing is really going to happen officially unofficial until he goes to Caiaphas the high priest. There's no sense in them walking off and having to be called again because they're only here for a little while. And they are standing right there if they're needed, and it's hollers, and they come. They're still responsible for him. He is bound. He is their prisoner. So they're not going off anywhere. That's the scenario that you have here. Now, think about this. If anybody is going to recognize Peter, it seems most likely that it would be the gang from the garden, right? And yet Peter, instead of going over and standing with Jesus and John, sidles up to the group here at the fire. Now, think about this too. The only crime that is committed is having a servant's ear cut off, right? And who's responsible for that? So you walk up to the fire where all the guards are and start warming yourself to blend in. If you're the only one in the garden that drew attention to yourself, you might as well just walk over and stand with Jesus and John, because sure enough, it ain't going to take long and somebody there at the fire is going to recognize him. But we'll get to that